Hello, CSW members, and anyone who may be joining us from wherever you are, wherever you're at, for another about hour, 75-minute long webinar today. My name is Alexandra Zanis. I am the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator here at the CASW. Welcome. I'm so happy to be seeing all of your virtual names today. So before I get into this excellent webinar topic, I just want to do a couple quick housekeeping notes for all of you who are veterans to this platform. Welcome. You can ignore me for a couple minutes. For anyone new, we're so happy to have you. Your entire screen is customizable, so take a couple minutes and make sure it's the best for your viewing needs. You can make the video bigger, the slides bigger. You can get rid of anything that maybe popped up that you don't really want anymore, that doesn't serve you. And of course, you can use those blue and white icons at the bottom of your screen to bring up anything that you may have closed either accidentally or on purpose. I want to flag for you that the certificate of attendance is available to you if you view the required viewing minutes for this presentation. That is 40 minutes. That certificate will be emailed to you, or you can log back on and access it anytime on the platform. Just make sure you view that 40 minutes if you're looking for that certificate of attendance today. Finally, the Q&A box is where you will go to ask any of your questions, any comments, anything that comes to your mind during the presentation. We will be moderating that and then doing a bit of a formal question and answer period at the end. Your questions are anonymous, so type them in as they come. We would love to compile them and chat with you. If you do want it to be published or put public, just let me know and I will push it to the audience. So just make sure that Q&A box is open and you're asking questions as they come to you throughout the presentation. So, into the topic for today. Today's presentation is titled Casualties of Care, Social Work as a Cog in the Machinery of White Supremacy. And today I am joined by the incredible Khadija Kahani. Khadija, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Khadija is an RSW and is the Social Justice Programming Coordinator at the Islamic Educational Center in the GTA, where she primarily works on anti-Islamophobia education and activism. And she's a board member for the nonprofit serving 2S LGBTQ2 plus young people across Ontario. Khadija writes and speaks regularly on issues of race, gender, and sexuality, both academically and in community settings. You can go to the speaker bio to access that, as well as the resource section for some of their publications. So Khadija, welcome. I'm so honored and grateful to have you here today. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And it's a pleasure to be here. Well, to be sitting here alone at home, looking at my screen for the Canadian Association of Social Workers, offering this webinar. But speaking of here, I want to begin by situating myself physically. And I think that's important as most of our gatherings are occurring online these days. We can become more and more disconnected from our geography. But it's important also for us to recognize that not considering our geography is a privilege, a function of our own feelings of colonized territory. And since I'm specifically speaking from the space commonly referred to as Toronto, I want to particularly acknowledge this piece of land that I'm on to be the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And so even as we gather today to critique white supremacy and reflect on our own complicity in it, we remember that we are only even here today as social workers gathered in shared digital space within this geography of Canada. We are only here today because of the foundational exercise of white entitlement on this colonized territory. An exercise of white entitlement that is exerted each day to maintain the settler-colonial project, but which is so normalized that we have to actively engage in these land acknowledgements in order to remember that. And it's a white entitlement that is exerted even in the seemingly contradictory act of critiquing this very white entitlement. And so, lest I pat myself on the back for the act of engaging in this critique of our profession, I remind myself that this critique is not an expression of morality, but one of honesty and responsibility, and that this responsibility goes beyond these conversations and into meaningful solidarity with Indigenous peoples for a decolonial future. And I remember that one way I can contribute is to donate to the legal fund at 1492 Lamback Lane, and you can Google that. These are Indigenous protesters who have been protecting their land from development and are facing criminalization for the acts of doing so. And so with all that said, let's get right into it. I just want to say thank you again to Alexandra for reaching out to me and arranging all of this. Alexandra's asked me to speak for about an hour, and then I think she'll open up the floor for questions. And I'll count on Alexandra to pipe in at any time if my sound isn't coming through, or if I, as is my wont, speaking over time, but I will try to keep it within the allotted time frame that we've discussed. So, casualties of care, social work as a cog in the machinery of white supremacy. So to situate and frame our analysis of social work, let's begin with a historical example. As social workers in the year 2020, most of us can look back on social work's participation in residential schools with, I hope, shame and disgust. As we know now, residential schools weren't just institutions of incredible violence in which Indigenous children were ripped apart from their families and subject to excruciating physical and emotional violence and abuse, not just spaces where one Government of Canada study found that the death rate in these institutions, in residential schools, to be almost 50% at one point, which, for reference, was higher than in the Nazi concentration camps. Not only do we know that residential schools were individually soul and body destroying for Indigenous children and their families, but we know that they were part of a larger campaign of assimilation to advance the settler-colonial project through erasing Indigenous life worlds, spiritualities, languages, and relationships with land. And that's why experts have clarified now that according to the UN definition of genocide, even without taking into account the physical deaths that took place in residential schools, that residential schools constituted genocide because they intended to destroy practices that make people who they are. And residential schools are so widely today recognized as a cruel and damaging system. Our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who was hardly known for his sympathy to the concept of colonization, and in fact, even once denied that Canada has a history of colonialism, but even Stephen Harper was able to issue an official apology on behalf of Canada for the existence of residential schools. So, knowing what is widely taken for granted as the truth of residential schools today, it's easy for us to say that the social workers who participated in the residential school project were the worst. And while yes, they were, but I think this kind of approach to historical expressions of injustice or particularities of injustice is unhelpful and dishonest because it allows us to distance ourselves from the enforcement of injustice that we oversee and participate in today. And so I think a better usage of history is to ask ourselves, how? How could a profession that has always been ostensibly about caring, how could a profession of caring have participated in such an egregious project of violence? And thus, how can this example of residential schools and social work's participation in residential schools, how can this example provide insight into our professional ethic and practice? One that interacts with our current conditions to make us complicit in the enforcement of racial subordination today. So I know that doesn't quite roll off the tongue as nicely, but usually the more nuanced analyses don't. So from this, what does social work's involvement in residential schools teach us about the operation of racism and how racism enlists in its project those of us in the profession of care? Well, it teaches us that complicity in racial hierarchies doesn't require A, hating racial others. The move to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the Canadian body politic was actually meant to be a progressive move away from explicit violence. and the physical extermination of Indigenous peoples. So residential schools were at the time a progressive project, and in fact, it had been so culturally successful at selling itself that assimilation was seen as a gift, understood as an act of generosity, in fact, because it gifted Indigenous peoples with access to the supposedly culturally superior way of being, aka whiteness. So it doesn't require hating racial others. It doesn't involve or doesn't require involvement in acts of physical violence or the desire for physical extermination. Even though, as I mentioned, physical violence was endemic in residential schools, it wasn't a central task. Physical violence wasn't an end unto itself, but seen as instrumental. Even though it wasn't nice, sometimes it was understood as necessary in order to properly inculcate Indigenous children into whiteness. And like I said, physical extermination wasn't the point of residential schools. It was cultural extermination. And in fact, there are many teachers and administrators in residential schools who we know of from our archives that actually spoke out against physical violence. So racial subordination doesn't necessitate physical violence. It doesn't necessitate participating in or even being aware of the entire racial machinery. Social workers didn't run residential schools. The extent of their involvement was, and it's been a history that's largely suppressed, but the extent of their involvement was often accompanying an Indian agent to a reserve to have the children forcibly removed, or when child welfare services became institutionalized, being absent from involvement in enforcing child protection measures in residential schools. Or in the case of the Canadian Association of Social Workers, in fact, issuing a statement to support the existence of residential schools. So social workers' involvement in residential schools was one of administration, of lending moral support, and of failing to act for child protection. And more broadly, residential schools themselves were just one piece in the pie of assimilation of Indigenous peoples, one which also involved the distribution of Indian status, for citizenship, further settlement of land, etc. And so any individual social worker who may have accompanied an Indian agent to the reserve to escort a child to residential school was just one small actor doing one small part of one small project towards a bigger project of settler colonialism. It doesn't require being conservative. In fact, residential schools were primarily driven by liberals and progressives. So, yeah, social work didn't do any of the above. And yet, from today's point of view, we can still look upon social work's participation in residential schools as definitively premised upon racism and reproductive of racism. So, what did social work's implication in the racist project of residential schooling necessitate? What did it actually involve? Things that are actually much more banal. A conscious or unconscious belief in inferiority, so that assimilation could be seen as a gift, a positive move, rather than one of extinguishing a legitimate cultural framework. It did necessitate a belief in the system, a willingness to assume that if government officials were doing it, then it must be good, or at least okay, at least benign. A willingness to do one's job, to prioritize the tasks for which one received a paycheck, and aversion to critical self-reflection about what one was doing because it qualified under the aegis of one's job, and a conflation of kindness with justice, and a conflation of good intention with good outcome. So that if as individuals we might have cared about or had some kind of concern or expressed kindness towards Indigenous children as they were being escorted to residential schools, then therefore our personal intention for our personal motivation translated into justice or good outcome. So, in other words, all of the elements required for social work's complicity in residential schools, being professional, having a desire to administer care, a willingness to disengage from the bigger picture, all of those elements are part of a professional ethic that is still very much alive and active today. And I include this quote by Carolina Kowalinsky, which isn't about social work, but which I think nicely summarizes a social work professional ethic that obscures and enables injustice through the performance of love and care. And as she writes, politics of care enables a form of armed love in which the moral imperative to act is accompanied by practices of violence and containment. Presentation. Um, we can apply the insight it gives us into the operations of caring racism, and apply it to a modern example. And in our case, the interactions of the social work profession with LGBTQ plus asylum seekers and refugees. So who are LGBTQ plus asylum seekers and refugees? And for shorthand, I'm going to refer to them as trans and queer asylum seekers and refugees. So they are those who have filed for, in the case of asylum seekers, or achieved, in the case of refugees, legal refugee status in Canada based on persecuted sexual and or gender identity practice or expression elsewhere. So in 1991, Canada actually became one of the first Western nations to grant refugee status due to persecution on the basis of sexual or gender expression or practice. And so just to give a sense of scope, about 2,000 or 13% of the 18,000 asylum decisions made between the years 2013 and 2015 were based on sexual orientation. And 70% of those claims were granted. So those who applied on the basis of persecuted sexual or gender identity were granted refugee status. And that's compared to 60% of all claims. So in general, claims based on persecuted sexual or gender identity tend to be more successful than those of others. So, why examine the operation of caring racism with respect to trans and queer asylum seekers and refugees? So, first of all, is a personal reason. This is a group that I've worked with in research. And despite being a queer person of color myself, and having studied academically the way that gender and sexuality and race are operationalized and interact with one another, despite this, my own understanding has greatly evolved since actually working with trans and queer asylum seekers and studying the context in more historical and political detail. So I understand myself as a perpetrator of the dominant social work discourse in relation to queer refugees, and I think this helps to implicate me in the very thing I'm critiquing and to offer up my own insight and wisdom to you about my own learning journey. Secondly, and more generally, refugee discourse is generally depoliticized. Um, Refugees are understood as the beneficiaries of this Canadian benevolence, and therefore our conversations around refugees tend to focus on depoliticized and benevolent questions, such as how we can better serve them, for example. But as Foucault or some other white dude has said quite accurately, the less seemingly political something is, the more something is seen as truth, as something that's taken for granted, as something that is outside of the realm of subjectivity or opinion. The less political something is, the more political it is, because it means that it has been accepted as truth, and truth is always a reflection of power. Um, and so the depoliticization of refugees is something that we should be concerned with and should be interested in uncovering to better uncover the operations of power. And thirdly, refugees can give us insight into the operations of sophisticated state racism. So often our understanding of racism is limited to the interpersonal. And those of us who identify as anti-racist, which I hope is a lot of us or most of us, we can clearly say, well, racism is bad, racism is wrong. But when non-white people are filtered through legal categories such as refugee or migrant worker or criminal, these legal categories that seem legitimate and natural and also objective and unracist because they are official terms, when non-white people are filtered through legal categories, then racism becomes less obvious, more legitimized, and therefore it becomes even more important to interrogate them for their racializing impacts. So, for context, the trans and queer refugees I have done work with were primarily Black. They were from African countries, and so in our discussions of anti-Black racism, I think we often don't include the additional layer of analysis, often investigating refugees, but a lot of refugees are Black, right? And so this presentation or this reflection will hopefully help provide some insight into the way that Blackness is filtered through refugee discourse in order to perpetuate negative racial outcomes for Black people from the global South. So, for the rest of this presentation, we'll discuss three means through which social work care is complicit in racialization in its work with trans and queer refugees, and specifically through the application of mental health labels, and specifically post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, the attribution of vulnerability to trans and queer refugees, and then lastly, efforts at cultural competence. And then we'll discuss how these social work practices fit into the larger project of the racial status quo, i.e. how our work is one cog in the machinery of white supremacy. Yeah, and so all that to say is we are just getting started, so let us get right to it. I just want to quickly do a check of time. Okay, so 21 minutes. Okay, so firstly, mental health labels and specifically post-traumatic stress disorder, aka PTSD. So the disciplined discourse and practice of psychiatry and mental health has forever aided and abetted the status quo. Here in the settler colonies of North America, it historically did this by incarcerating in insane asylums those who violated racial hierarchies. So, for example, Indigenous peoples who refused to relinquish their spiritual practices in violation of an Indian agent, or Black people who post emancipation from slavery were considered insufficiently docile to whites. Indigenous and Black people who violated their supposed place in the racial hierarchy could be incarcerated in insane asylums. And these were places of violence, but also places where they were literally removed from their societies and could, of course, no longer contribute to any kind of activism or political movement. So incarceration. Secondly, psychiatry lent up the supposed objectivity or the scienciness of its discipline towards justifying racism. So, for example, psychiatry theorized that Black people were suited for subordination and therefore escaped slaves could be diagnosed with the psychiatric disorder of drapetomania. Indigenous peoples were psychologically categorized as primitive or childlike, and therefore colonial domination could be understood as an act of paternal altruism rather than violent subjugation. Thirdly, psychiatry helped conduct research on colonized communities, studying their cultural and psychological norms and mores in order to better understand them and hence better dominate them. But just more fundamentally, more structurally, the very field of psychiatry has been constructed out of ideas of race. In other words, our definition of psychiatrically abnormal has been defined in relation to colonized and dominated non-white. So that, for example, Freud could draw equivalencies between insane whites and racial primitives. To summarize that, those who are racialized were considered mad, and those who are mad approached the subjectivity of those who were racialized. Today, psychiatry and mental health is, of course, less explicitly racially motivated, but it nonetheless participates in enforcing existing hierarchies. Psychiatry is a dominant field, and it acts to serve the interests of dominance. And that's an important framing. I mean, I think for any mainstream discourse or institution or field of knowledge, it's a dominant field and it acts in the interest of dominance. And today it achieves the enforcement of racial and other dominance by one, individualizing social conditions so that depression is a result of personal defect or a personal problem rather than the result of a depressing society. So it individualizes and it enforces a definition of normal that acts in the service of the white supremacist capitalist status quo. So, for example, alcoholism is diagnosed as a psychiatric disorder, but workaholism isn't. And the two differing statuses of alcoholism versus workaholism doesn't reflect on how distressing or destructive these two issues are, but rather how well they serve the interests of capital. Workaholism, it works in the interest of the capitalist status quo. And in fact, we are implicitly encouraged towards a kind of mindset of workaholism. And alcoholism actually arrests capitalist productivity. So in other words, to summarize, psychiatry today or mental health knowledge today works to distract and obscure ongoing oppression, legitimize the status quo, tranquilize resistance, and produce suitable capitalist subjects. And it's able to do this because it presents as objective and is rooted in science, and thereby failing to account for the way that it derives from a particular context and supports the perpetuation of that context. So, how does this apply to trans and queer refugees? Well, it's common sense now to assume that refugees suffer from PTSD. If you just Google refugee and PTSD, I did that, you get over 1 million results. In my own research with trans and queer refugees, when I was conducting a literature review, virtually every article, academic article on the subject was about PTSD symptoms among trans and queer refugees. More anecdotally, as a social worker, I know it's common practice within the nonprofit space to quite casually apply the diagnosis of PTSD to a whole range of people we work with, but almost inevitably to trans and queer asylum seekers and refugees. Of course, as social workers, we know we're not actually empowered to make psychiatric diagnoses, but this actually just goes to show how psychiatry doesn't just stay in its discipline and only affect those who practice it or those who receive it, but it's relevant to a broader social discourse. And it also shows, I think, how medicalized social work has become, so that galvanizing and deploying psychiatric concepts and labels is considered routine, rather than a departure from our work, which has the word social in its name, not medical. It's important, I think, to recognize that PTSD or even trauma isn't truth. And by this, I mean that trauma isn't an objective reality. It's not just a taken for granted truth, or it shouldn't be that the experience of trauma imprints upon the brain in a particular way in order to manifest in certain behaviors. Rather, trauma and PTSD are a particular way of organizing and interpreting reality. So what we know from the history of psychological trauma as a concept is that it was originally applied to incidents of physical injury, and specifically in the context of railway accidents. And it eventually, so it started off as a physical condition with physical symptoms and physical manifestations, and then it eventually made its way into psychological discourse. So in a way that managed to analogize the idea of physical trauma to psychological trauma, and to inherit a lot of the associations with this really particular psychological or physical impact that trauma imprints upon the brain. Given this social nature of trauma, so given the idea that it's not truth, but it's a way that we've decided to understand and interpret the reality of psychological harm, given the social nature of trauma, there are generalized critiques of PTSD as a diagnosis. So firstly, PTSD locates the deficiency or the illness in the victim of trauma rather than the people or society that victimize. And therefore, our area of concern is we work with victims rather to correct the impacts of trauma rather than working with a society that systematically victimizes. So one, the area of concern or the way that it directs our gaze. Secondly, PTSD functions to effectively normalize a trauma-free life. If PTSD is the illness, then its referent, the presumed normal, is a life without such trauma. So, for example, a woman who experiences trauma as a result of sexual assault can be diagnosable with PTSD. But the majority of women and femmes in this world experience sexual assault. And so exceptionalizing this experience through a diagnosis erases the reality of systemic patriarchy. And I think here it's unsurprising to note that the people in charge of creating diagnoses, i.e., principally white, cis, straight male psychiatrists, it's not surprising that they should find trauma abnormal rather than routine, right? Because they are not systematically traumatized by a traumatizing world. And three, PTSD actually was originally applied to war veterans in the US returning from Vietnam. And it has been applied to perpetrators of violence who suffer the lasting emotional toll of having to take life, as well as the victims of violence. In this way, PTSD acts as an equalizer. So if both victim and perpetrator can be traumatized, then diagnostically speaking, equivalencies are being drawn between victim and perpetrator. Both are injured and both are supposedly rightfully due treatment and compensation and kind of social legitimacy. So that's the general critique of PTSD. And if we apply it specifically to the way that it's deployed in the cases of refugees and specifically trans and queer refugees, Dr. Didier Fasson and Richard Reckman, in their book, The Empire of Trauma, they trace the evolution of PTSD discourse in relation to refugee rights. And what they note is that there's an increasing expectation that asylum seekers will produce a record of PTSD, one that is attested to by a physician or psychologist. And that this demand or this need for PTSD parallels the increasing distrust in the legitimacy of asylum seekers. So it's no longer enough for an asylum seeker, and I know this also based on the people that I worked with, it's no longer enough for someone to say that something has happened to them and therefore that they are entitled to refuge under international law. It's no longer enough. You now need external confirmation of that truth from someone who, according to this system, has been deemed authoritative, but who ultimately has no idea what you went through and who can't even really prove what you went through because generally the physical or psychological irrefutable evidence doesn't exist. So in other words, this system reflects and reproduces white institutional legitimacy at the expense of those with the legal entitlement to asylum. And this need for PTSD also parallels the general undermining of refugee rights. So according to refugee law, a refugee doesn't have to be someone who's actually been traumatized or even undergone torture or persecution. All that's required is a reasonable fear of persecution. But this medicalization of human experience via PTSD and the way that it relates to systems of Western authority, it ultimately reflects and reproduces both the distrust of asylum seekers and the undermining of refugee rights, right? Because no longer is a fear of persecution sufficient. There also needs to be evidence of persecution, and there needs to be evidence of lasting psychological impact for that persecution to be registered. And along these lines, people must end up self-registering as a victim in order to access refugee status. So in other words, the basics of safety, which come with international law, the basics of safety for refugees comes at the cost of understanding one's life purely through the lens of victimhood. And finally, and most importantly, PTSD creates a timeline of trauma. So it literally refers to the after effects of a trauma that happened historically. And So this situates the injury as existing firmly in the past. So for example, like that book that I referenced, Empire of Trauma, Fasten and Reckman, as they note, both before and after Hurricane Katrina, the people of New Orleans were already victims of poverty and discrimination that reinforced class inequities through racial distinctions. Trauma is not only silent on these realities, it obscures them by creating or by generating this timeline of trauma. So let's actually unpack this timeline of trauma, this PTSD engendered timeline of trauma, with respect to trans and queer refugees, one that assumes that refugees have experienced a historical injury and any remaining emotional or psychological distress is purely a function of its after effects, not of any ongoing injury. This timeline of trauma obscures the reality of refugeeism. So let's complicate this. First, the pre-context of PTSD, the supposed site of traumatic injury. Well, firstly, let's look at the actual origins of global homophobia and transphobia, the reason why there are queer refugees in the first place. Well, the global homophobia and transphobia in the global south that produces queer refugees is not historical. It's not inevitable. It hasn't been going on forever. It is a specific legacy of Western and particularly British colonialism. British colonizers labeled their colonized populations as queer because they generally failed to live up to British standards of heterosexual sex, gender binary, and monogamy. And so they used punishment of queerness as one mechanism to enforce colonial control. And one way they did this was through legislation that criminalized sodomy and other expressions of queerness. So while these forms of colonialism are officially over, that legal and social legacy, that legal and social imprint of imported transphobia and homophobia remains. So I have a quote here from one study that found that the majority of those states with a British colonial legacy continue to criminalize homosexual conduct, and that B, a majority of those states that criminalize queer conduct are former British colonies. So there's a very clear and direct and obvious correlation between the kind of transphobia and homophobia that trans and queer refugees come to Canada to escape from and its legacy in the intervention of the West. And it's a transphobia and homophobia that Western states have largely overcome, at least in its most explicit manifestations, but that clearly continues to impact those in the formerly colonized world. Of course, we can't only understand global queer phobia according to historical analysis, but even its modern day exacerbators reflect the legacy of imperial rule. And specifically, the economic imbalances established through Western colonialism remain, so that the excesses, the material excesses of the West are still financed in large part through the exploitation of the non-West. So, for example, a 2017 report from a group of NGOs calculated that sub-Saharan Africa is actually a net creditor to the rest of the world. Billions more actually leave the region each year through dodged taxes, repatriated profits, illegal logging, fishing, trade, and wildlife. Billions more actually leave the region each year than enter via loans or remittances or aids. Of course, none of this debt is actually collectible by sub-Saharan African countries, because one way that our global economic and political system reproduces the political and economic disenfranchisement of the global south is through selective recognition of debts. And so this ensures the perpetual reproduction of disparities. And so, as one commentator put it in response to this report, Africa is rich, but we steal its wealth. And that is a reversal of the dominant narrative that Africa is poor, and therefore any kind of aid that is going into it from Western regions is an act of charity in order to support African countries in their poverty, which is deemed natural. So it's actually quite the opposite. But what does this have to do with queerphobia? Well, a 2014 study by City Lab found an inverse correlation between homophobia and economic development. So the more poverty in a region, the more evidence towards intolerance, the more evidence of intolerance towards sexual minorities. And this makes sense. Poverty breeds strife because people are made to compete with one another over meager resources. And one mechanism through which people find ways to distinguish between themselves and therefore justify material discrimination is through the exploitation of difference. And sexual and gender difference is one way that this difference making is achieved. So, but even beyond a direct relationship between poverty and discrimination, all sexual and gender minorities exist in bodies, and those bodies have material needs. And so it's actually quite arbitrary for us to limit our concern with queer well-being to the persecution of queers as queers. So, for example, consider that sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned, that is actually a net creditor to the world. Sub-Saharan Africa is the fastest producing migrant region in the world. Some of those people who are leaving are casualties of poverty resulting from Western economic exploitation. Others are sexual and gender minorities suffering from the legacy of Western imported transphobia and homophobia. And still others are both queers who are suffering from both queerphobia and poverty. Regardless of the specific impetus for any one particular migrancy, the reality is that people's homes cannot accommodate them. So now the post-context of PTSD. Canada, the supposed site of refuge from the trauma of the place that they're seeking refuge from. Well, first, let's look at the refugee system. So generally, we think of the refugee system as this system that will grant entry to anyone who is fleeing persecution and unsafety. And we know that the bureaucracy, or we think that the bureaucracy or the administration involved in the refugee system is what is necessarily or what is necessary and objectively required to distinguish between those who are bona fide and those who are not. So any administration involved in the refugee system, any process through which people are distinguished as bona fide or non-bona fide refugees, that's seen as necessary. But the administration of refugees isn't tangential to the refugee system, it's actually central to it. And the administration of the refugee system is actually one that is full of violence. So those asylum seekers who enter Canada through the US are turned away, or they have to endure dangerous routes in order to make it here because of the Safe Third Country Agreement, recently overturned by the federal court, but being challenged by our government. And the premise of the Safe Third Country Agreement is that the US is a safe haven, and therefore any refugee who enters the US can safely file for asylum there and doesn't need to enter into Canada. Of course, knowing what we do about the US, it is impossible to actually assert that the US constitutes a safe haven. But Canada makes itself complicit in the denial of refugee rights by refusing to acknowledge the violence of the US and its immigration and refugee system. So those who enter through the US are either turned away or locked up or have to endure dangerous routes in order to get here through non-designated ports of entry. Once asylum seekers are here, there can be months-long waits for refugee hearing, so that a person could have built an entire life here and then find out that their application for refuge has been denied and they'll be sent back to where they came from. While people are waiting for the refugee hearing, there is intrusive monitoring of asylum seekers, which often includes regular check-ins with the Canadian Border Services Agency. And asylum seekers, even children, can be held in indefinite for trans that they are made particularly vulnerable to violence in these prison spaces. So to be clear, no Canadian citizen could ever legally be held in prison indefinitely and without ever being charged of a crime, and certainly not a child. But yet, when we are working with non-citizens, this suddenly becomes acceptable. And so this also reflects on what I was saying about through these arbitrary legal categories like refugee or migrant worker or criminal that work to exceptionalize treatment of certain people because it's considered legitimate because they fall under this particular category of person. So non-Canadian citizens can be held in indefinite administrative detention, people who are seeking asylum. At the refugee hearing, asylum seekers are forced to relive their most painful life experiences in order to prove that they are bona fide asylum seekers. And for trans and queer asylum seekers, the method for proving their queerness has been critiqued as highly invasive and based on false and Western stereotypes about what queers look like and what they do. And after all of this, asylum seekers can be deported if they fail to adequately prove their persecution to a refugee panel. And Ottawa has already resumed the deportations it had previously put on hold during the pandemic. So asylum seeker deportations are back on. So effectively, asylum seekers are treated as fraudulent until proven refugee, which is important to note is actually a violation of the ethic and the obligations under international refugee law. Canada's administrative treatment of queer asylum seekers is actually a reflection of Canada's anxiety about migration. And this is what effectively gets to the crux of the refugee issue. Canada creates the very displaced people that come to its doors as refugees. So the intrusive interrogation of refugees is meant to ensure that they're bona fide. And particularly, one thing that refugee officials are particularly concerned with identifying and screening out are so-called economic migrants. As I already mentioned, fleeing economic deprivation is no less life or death than fleeing transphobic and homophobic persecution. But Canada, and no country actually, recognizes economic migrants as refugees, even though Canada actually quite directly creates these refugees. So in Haiti, for example, Canada played an instrumental role in the 2004 Haitian coup and in then implementing a neoliberal economic restructuring program that pushed many, many Haitians into poverty. But in 2017, for example, Canada sent over 500 people back to Haiti on the grounds that they were not legitimate asylum seekers. The reason Canada can accept refugees is the same reason that others are in need of refuge. A global economic and political system that hoards wealth in small parts of the world and with small numbers of people. And Canada can't morally or materially or practically afford to recognize all of its victims of displacement. And so, in addition to creating the refugees who have to enter Canada, like those economic migrants, Canada also has to subject these refugees to indignities and cruelties in order to assess whether they meet the arbitrary criteria for refuge, and if not, like in the case of those Haitian migrants, send them back. And so post the refugee process, once trans and queer asylum seekers become trans and queer refugees, they become queer racialized Canadians. And this is a context where official policies in Canada, we have official policies of multiculturalism and queer rights that are unprecedented across the globe. And there's not only tolerance for diversity, but there's official celebration of it. I mean, so Justin Trudeau marches in the Pride Parade. We not only tolerate diversity, but we have official and widespread celebration of it. But despite this, this is also a context where people who are oppressed by virtue of their race, gender, sexuality, and immigration status, aka trans and queer refugees, or all trans and queer people, Canada is a context where statistically, queers and queer people of color are much more likely to live in poverty, food insecurity, to be homeless or underhoused or precariously housed, where they are more likely to experience addiction, depression, anxiety, and suicidality, where they are underrepresented in positions of political power, where they experience hate crimes and interpersonal violence, and where they experience systemic discrimination in social services. and the people I interviewed during my own research experienced all these forms of marginalizations. This this contradiction between official celebration versus lived reality, I think, can be neatly summed up as being the effects of liberal capitalism. So one where diverse identities are given acknowledgements and rights, but where our right to material security isn't acknowledged. So for example, queer youth are overrepresented in statistics of homelessness. And we often attribute this to domestic transphobia and homophobia, so that when a kid comes out to their parents as queer, they often find themselves kicked out of their homes. But rather than only ask, why are people so hateful of queers that they would kick their children out of their homes, we should also ask, why should someone being kicked out of their home mean that they become homeless? It's because our economic and political system doesn't protect any of us from poverty, that trans and queer people, that racialized people, that anyone oppressed by an aspect of their identity. It's because our system doesn't protect us from poverty that we are all made so vulnerable to interpersonal discrimination. And then finally, as Catherine Faubert writes, and I have the quote here, an analysis that is often left out of the reality of settler colonialism, an analysis often left out of our discussion of refugees, is the reality of settler colonialism. But we always have to remember that the right to accept and reject refugees is an assertion of ownership over colonized land that is premised upon and further reproduces the lack of sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. And being given refuge puts refugees unwillingly into settler relationships with Indigenous peoples. And it also obscures the nature of the settlement because refugee is constructed under this discourse of benevolence that hides the fact of ongoing and escalating settlement. So I'm just going to do myself another time check. Oh, wow. Okay. I'm already at 51 minutes.
Sorry. I'm literally just eating a little bit of salad as I'm sitting here.
I noticed
Don't worry don't worry too much about the time frame. For those who need to hop off, they can hop off and log back on and watch the recorded version. So don't worry too much about the time. Just make sure you get to the things you want to get to.
Okay. Thanks, Alexandra, and I will try to get through it a little bit more quickly. So the diagnosis of trans and queer asylum seekers with PTSD, which is done casually by social workers, but also officially by psychologists and physicians, this diagnosis of PTSD obscures the timeline of trauma by situating trauma as existing firmly in the past and evacuating that past of the context of Western imperialism. And this BTS narrative contributes to this simplistic binary of violent home country versus liberated country of refuge. Home country. And we'll discuss in more detail later the way that that simplistic binary is reproduced across all of Canadian society and ends up reproducing global race relations. A second means by which social work participates in racial discourse is through the attribution of vulnerability. So it's common within nonprofits to refer to the groups that we work with as vulnerable. And quite obviously, that's supposed to be the premise of our interaction with them. But as Amy Katz said, and she's a researcher at St. Michael's who co-authored a paper that did a discourse analysis on the use of vulnerability in public health literature, as she writes, no group of people is inherently vulnerable. If a group of people is experiencing vulnerability in a particular situation, setting, system, or society, that vulnerability is being produced by other people. It is entirely possible to trace how that vulnerability is produced and who is responsible. When we leave it at vulnerable groups, the implication is that the vulnerability is built in. It's a deficit, it's a condition internal to that group. So our role as healthcare providers or researchers is then to save people from their own vulnerability. And I think this just really hits the nail on the head. But the overwhelming tendency to refer to people as vulnerable it's not just a careless mistake or a misattribution, and its consequences are more than semantic. Vulnerability discourse, by locating the problem in a person rather than in a system or society that processes that person, the status data of urban society. We would study the banks and the insurance industry that mark out areas of the city to which they will not sell insurance or extend credit. So, in other words, vulnerability keeps us examining the wrong thing. And in so doing, vulnerability discourse has implications, A, for responsibility for addressing material deprivation. By understanding people as vulnerable rather than understanding the system as manufacturing vulnerability, state support is understood in terms of generosity rather than obligations. As we already discussed, refugees are produced by the very Western governments who grant them refugee status. But under vulnerability discourse, the very perpetrators of injustice are reframed as the benevolent givers of refugee status and entitlements. And then on the flip side of that, service cuts, lack of economic support, and restricting refugee numbers isn't unjust because it was all a gift anyway. And then secondly, vulnerability discourse has implications for how we address the problem. Specifically, vulnerability discourse has us fixing people rather than the system and the society. And we'll see that's why there's so much government funding on financial literacy, for example, rather than government efforts to address economic injustice. Why there's so much government funded support programming on mental health support rather than government efforts to address the social, economic, and political landscape that produces mental distress in the first place. And so this is a real-life application of vulnerability discourse, which not only keeps people oppressed, but denigrates the oppressed, distracts from oppression, all the while portraying itself as benevolent and therefore keeping the system functioning. Vulnerability informs also our intimate relationships with our clients. If they are the problem, then of course we are the solution. And as Chapman and Withers write in their very powerful book, A Violent History of Benevolence, social work ethic attributes a healing power to relationships of domination that are directed by people who imagine themselves morally superior to those that they help. And what's more is that this interpersonal relationship is multiplied across our entire profession. The very fact of our profession is a reflection and a reproduction of this vulnerability discourse. So again, as Chapman and Withers write, that the political solution to poverty could be cumulative visits from ruling class people who offer advice and who ensure that poor people receive only the most necessary and minimal material relief, if any at all, clearly depoliticize poverty and equality. So in other words, vulnerability as a discourse and social work as a profession work to decontextualize or falsely contextualize reality. And it allows us as social workers to forget the fact that both of us, helper and helped, social worker and client, both of us are differently positioned, yet still mutually subject to a system that systematically creates deprivation. And our role in the system is to obscure this by self-moralizing, and this in turn legitimizes the system that creates us. Vulnerability functions to exalt the helper and denigrate. I am a brown woman, a person of color. As a social worker, I'm fulfilling a role in a white institution. So it functions to exalt the helper and denigrate the help. And this nurtures that binary we discussed. Agentic savior of liberated country of refuge. So we see this binary once again. And then lastly, the last social work operation I wanted to discuss is efforts at cultural competence. And we don't have a lot of time, so I am going to try to just kind of skim over this section just so that you at least have an indication of what I'm getting at. And I mean, I say cultural competence here, but there are a variety of other terms we use these days. But whatever we call it, the desire to know those we work with is a central preoccupation of social work. One cultural competence tool I've seen used widely in nonprofits, and one that supposedly helps us to understand our trans and queer refugee clients, is this map that I have here, produced by the International Lesbian and Gay Association. And you might not be able to actually pick it out, but the map color codes the world according to sexual tolerance. So the purpose of it being to paint a portrait of global homophobia. And so the different metrics it accounts for are criminalization, um, legal protection, so whether states have protection for of rights for sexual minorities, and whether states recognize gay marriage and allow for gay adoption. The foundational premise of cultural competence is that obviously we have the capacity to actually evaluate ways of life alternative to ours. And this seems obvious, but it's important for us to acknowledge the fact that A, our frameworks of sexuality and gender are the product of particular historical conditions, and hence they are unique to our context. These frameworks, in turn, engender our priorities for change and benchmarks for progress, and that these frameworks, and hence priorities and benchmarks, aren't universal. And so just to give an example of this, to illustrate what I mean by this, let's look at one example of a non-universal premise that underpins our sexuality and gender frameworks, one that's reflected in the map. So a central premise of sexuality discourse, one that we take for granted, is that our sexual orientation is who we are. It's not just what we do or what we like, but it is who we are, and it's an important part of who we are. But the idea that sexuality as ontology, the idea that sexuality is our identity, isn't historical or even universal. Professor John D'Amelio traces the history of homosexuality to the emergence of capitalism as a dominant system. And what capitalism did was it allowed more people to organize their love lives around desire. And so there became more evidence of same gender domesticity or practice, and this resulted in the medical pathologization of same gender sexual behavior via medical discourse. So homosexuality became a diagnosis. In other words, homosexuality came into existence because it was considered a deviance. Homosexuality exists because of homophobia. There's no homophobia without homosexuality. There's no homosexuality without homophobia. The two are co-constituted. So even though we've overcome technically homosexuality as a disease, it still occupies a place of identity. And so given this social space it takes up, it's natural that our queer activism should revolve around things that affirm and celebrate this identity, so that we fight for things such as legal rights or the recognition and protection of our sexual selves. But this isn't necessarily the case everywhere, despite the increasing hegemony of Western sexuality frameworks around the world. So for example, I have a quote here by Dr. Nahid Islam, who says, "The fact that there's no word for lesbian in Bengali, Hindi, or Urdu is a linguistic clue to cultural and structural organizations of sexuality in their respective societies." So the fact that there are a handful of countries with prohibitions on homosexual behavior between men but not women is a possible reflection of this, right? So criminalization is a condemnation of behavior, not of gay identity per se. And if it was, this would necessarily extend to women who are classified as gay as well. Further, as I already mentioned, homosexuality as identity came about in the context of medical pathologization. And so sexuality as identity isn't necessary for the well-being of queers. So according to one report from Bhutan, for example, Bhutan has no LGBT nonprofits, bars, or bookstores, no LGBT institutions, whatever. So effectively, there's no queer culture. There's no basis for queer identity, and there's no culture that's organized around queer identity. And yet, according at least to this one report, Bhutan's small LGBT population has experienced very little persecution or violence. So like I said, we don't have time to deconstruct in detail the other non-universal premises of our frameworks of sexuality and gender. But I hope the point is still made clear even through this one example. which is to say that cultural competence tools like the ILGA map aren't really helpful for understanding the picture of sexual and gender embodiment and expression around the world. When we measure the world according to protection of rights, legal permissibility, and gay marriage, what we are doing is applying our gender and sex frameworks and the progress metrics that flow from these frameworks. We're applying those frameworks onto other parts of the world. This doesn't reflect the realities of those parts of the world. All it does is reflect our own cultural lens. And when we falsely universalize our own framework of sexuality and gender, we create a single trajectory of progress. And of course, within our own frameworks, this trajectory of progress that we've created will necessarily always position ourselves at the forefront. And so, once again, we see through the operation of cultural competence tool, we see the reproduction of this binary that I referenced in relation to PTSD and vulnerability, that of homophobic and transphobic country of origin versus queer-loving country of refuge. Okay, so I'm going to just try to wrap it up here. Alexandra, I do hope that's okay, because I think I need to kind of bring this all together.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So the galvanization of mental health knowledges, vulnerability, cultural competence efforts, this reflects how social work care participates in a dominant discourse, one that creates a binary between the backwards, i.e. transphobic, homophobic, refugee-producing country that trans and queer asylum seekers come from versus enlightened refugee-accepting Canada. And this binary supports a broader civilizational discourse, one that exalts the West and white people as enlightened and advanced, based in part on this image of tolerance for sexual and gender diversity. So a binary that exalts the West and white people and denigrates the global South and Black and brown people, based in part on this image of backwards and illogical hatred for sexual and gender minorities. And as Shireen Razak notes, this civilizational discourse denies a common bond of humanity between whites and non-whites. And since there is no common bond of humanity, there is no common law. So put otherwise, this civilizational binary effectively evicts from humanity those racial others who are subject to classification as backwards, thereby justifying domination and exploitation of them. As Professor Letitia Subse says, asylum seekers are welcomed on the basis of non-discrimination. However, the development of anti-migrant policies, where migrants are by default assumed to be homophobic and have to prove their liberal credentials, gives clear account of the othering logic on which integration is based. So in other words, the supposed welcoming of queers from other parts of the world is one side of this coin, premised upon the transphobic and homophobic and otherwise hateful backwardness of the racial other. It's one side of a coin, one of which is welcoming of the persecuted, and the other side is expulsion and regulation of those racial others who are deemed persecutory. And we see this dehumanization of the racial other based on their civilizational othering through things like immigrant values tests, Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, niqab and hijab bans, domestic legislation that surveils and denies racial others based on the suspicion of them as being transphobic and homophobic and misogynistic. We see the deployment of the civilizational discourse in foreign policy, like a war in Afghanistan, justified in part based on the need to protect Muslim women from their headscarves, of course, failing to acknowledge that women are the most negatively impacted by war. We see this civilizational discourse operationalized in the distrust of the very asylum seekers who are supposedly being rescued from their backward societies. We see this civilizational discourse in the exploitation of migrant workers, non-citizen workers who have been forced to migrate to the West because of Western economic exploitation and who are then forced to work in substandard conditions without basic rights and protections. And we see this civilizational discourse operational in the ongoing resource and labor theft of the global South, theft that ensures a perpetual people. As Anders Lustgarten has written, refugees don't need our tears. They need us to stop making them refugees. This discourse of Canada the good versus global South countries the bad, however, obscures this reality. It makes legitimate or distracts from all of those good activities that maintain the economic and political hegemony of the West, to the deprivation of the non-West. In other words, this civilizational discourse and social work participation in it allows Canada to benefit from a system that systematically produces displaced people, all the while extracting moral currency for granting conditional and limited entry to a fraction of its victims. And this enables the constant reproduction of racial outcomes at the global level. And just really quickly, the role that social work plays in perpetuating this good versus bad civilizational binary is small and it's contingent, but we're still there as a cog in the machinery of white supremacy. We also see there, political discourse, the refugee system, dominant queer discourse, all of that, and yet social work plays a unique and particular role in perpetuating it. And we play a special part, actually, and special not in the good way, to be clear. As Barbara Herron puts it so well, thinking of oneself as moral enables bourgeoisie subjects to normalize our part in global domination through a sense of entitlement and obligation inscribed with innocence. Because this racialized civilizational discourse gains its currency from its supposed morality, we, social workers, as presumed agents of morality, are its perfect messengers. We're the perfect messengers of civilizational discourse because of what we represent in the social sphere. And because we're not just actually discursive messengers, we're material messengers. We give access to limited material and social and emotional supports. We provide just enough balm to the wound of inequality and just enough distraction from it to diffuse resistance and allow the system to continue chugging along. And so finally, if we return to our historical example of social work complicity in residential schools, I think we can see that our contribution to racism in relation to our work with trans and queer asylum seekers is similar. Our practices and discourses are rooted in an ethic of care, and as individual practitioners of care, it's not obvious what our role is in the broader project of racial subordination. But just as we rightfully critique the social workers of yesterday who accompanied the Indian agent to the reserve, forcibly remove a child to residential school, we should also not take refuge in our good intentions, our kindness, or the fact that we play a very small part in the broader picture. And so, in conclusion, there's an inherent contradictory interest in our profession as social workers. As individuals, we are, for the most part, doing what we do because we want to intervene positively into the world, to make the world more bearable or even good for people. But at the collective level, our very existence is evidence of the problems with our world, one that necessarily creates widespread suffering. We discuss the effects of the system on trans and queer refugees, but the reality is that this world is organized in general to filter opportunity and well-being to a small group of people and to ensure misery for the rest, as well as to non-human animals and to future generations. But not only does our existence reflect a problem, our job also involves us in reproducing the problem. We inject an illusion of morality into the system and provide minimal relief to injustice, allowing for the system to continue as it does. And so I think it's a responsibility of all of us in social work towards eliminating our profession in the way it is today, so that we can live in a world in which our well-being, in which our professional, economic, social, political, and moral well-being, in which our well-being isn't a direct outcome of the misery of others. And that's the world that I want to live in and to practice social work in. And so, Alexandra, I'm so sorry. I am good at many things, but brevity is not one of them. And so I'm sorry that I've gone quite a bit over time. But I wanted to just leave up here. And I also apologize that I didn't time it properly so that I didn't have to rush through a lot of what I was going to say. But I hope if people do have time and are okay to stick around, I can answer some questions including those areas I didn't get to cover. But I'm just keeping on here some excellent references that I think are really helpful. And I especially want to point to the first thing there, A Violent History of Benevolence by Chris Chapman and A.J. Withers, which is like a brilliant tome on the history of social work and on like historical discourses of benevolence and how they interact with systems of today to reproduce violence. So it's a brilliant book, and I hope people will refer to it.
Yeah, well, if anyone needs to apologize, I think it's probably us for trying to ask you to recount the entire history of social work in 75 minutes. So thank you.
Well, to be fair, I don't think you asked me to do that. I think I tried to take it upon myself and did not do the thorough job that I wanted to, but I hope if people are still sticking around, we have some time, of course, we can still get more into it.
And you only went 10 minutes over, so like, I don't even, anyway. Okay. On to the good part of the presentation. Yes. So we do have a lot of questions, and for anyone who's still on with us, feel free to, and there's a lot of you still on with us, so feel free to type your questions. We're going to do a bit of a formal Q&A right now, but a huge thank you to Khadija for this incredible opportunity. I've been sitting here so honored and thrilled that we had an opportunity to do this, and I know that a lot of people feel the same way. So let's get into it. Question number 1. How does the policy of asylum-seeking children fit in with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child? Any ideas there?
Oh, I actually, I've heard somewhere that we should really get used to saying, I don't know. So I will say that actually I don't know. I don't know that much about the UN policy on the rights of the child, but I mean, I don't know if this is your question, but if there's more context, like a specific thing that
yeah, no, it's not my question. It's not my question. So for the individual who submitted it, feel free to just maybe provide exactly what about the CHCRC you're looking to talk about in terms of asylum-seeking children, because the UNCHRC or UNCRC is massive. So maybe I'll get them to clarify what area it is that they're looking for.
But Alexandra, sorry, actually, as we were just discussing, I think in general, so I don't actually know what's stipulated in the rights of the child, but it is true that in general, like I mentioned, children can be held in indefinite administrative detention, asylum-seeking children. And so in general, immigrant children and refugee children are adulted, and they're given treatment, like as we've seen in the US, with children, being put in cages and separated from their families. They're adulted in a way that undermined from their rights as humans, and particularly from their rights as children. So I think it's definitely an important thing to consider their child, that these are children that we're talking about. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly. I guess moving on, wondering about if the sexual orientation laws in the world map, is that a good resource to use?
So okay, so like I was saying, the way that the map depicts reality. So if you actually look at the map, it very quite directly maps over the West versus East, global North versus global South civilizational divide, right? So like every single one of like the protections and entitlements that you see for sexual and gender minorities depicted on the map, they fall along those same civilizational binaries, right? So in that way, I think it's not helpful because like I said, it is premised on a particular gender and sexuality framework. I guess if you want to know like specific laws in specific places, sure, that's a resource. But I think, we use it as a stand-in for actually understanding the reality of those places. And I think what's also important to note is how much is left off of that map. So something I didn't get a chance to say is that like the kind of discourse that comes out of the map is this. In CBC in 2017, they were announcing, like CBC TV on the news was saying like how Canada elected its first trans mayor in Quebec in 2017. Okay, And then it went on to say that, but transphobia and homophobia still exists around the world. And then they went on to basically give the content of this map so that it's legal to be gay in X and X part of the world, right? So first of all, they're conflating gender and sexuality. But then secondly, by doing so, by making that conflation, what they're also doing is preventing any kind of way that we could understand the global south as having something to teach us. So Canada elected its first trans mayor in Canada in 2017. India elected its first trans mayor in the year 2000. Right? And Pakistan recognized a third gender well before Canada, even though sodomy is illegal in Pakistan, right? So I think the map is unhelpful because it's premised on a particular framework that prioritizes certain metrics for understanding the global landscape of transphobia and homophobia. And in so doing, it actually prevents us from learning from other parts of the world about what's possible and actually learning about the nuances of sexuality and gender. So the reality is that it's not that Pakistan recognized the third gender before Canada. It's not that it's more progressive than Canada or less progressive. I think the thing is we just need to stop thinking of things on this linear, right? It's that different cultural and gender structures and frameworks make possible certain things and they arrest certain other things. And so just looking within this kind of very simplistic, you're better, you're more queer phobic versus you're more queer loving, that's not really helpful for understanding the state of the world. And so it's not just about being anti-racist, it's also about actually taking seriously the example of other parts of the world and what they can teach us about how to advance our own gender and sexual understandings.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I even remember up before 2015, Canada's rank for women in government was like 56th, below Afghanistan, below, like, before we had a cabinet that was more or less had gender parity. Canada, up until 5 years ago, had no women in government. And we were supposed to be a leading member of, right? Like, what?
Exactly. And I mean, that's an excellent point. And I mean, we like to sit here and use the example of Saudi Arabia as an example of, negative women's rights in the Muslim majority world. But 9 Muslim majority countries have elected women as their heads of state. Canada has never elected. I mean, we had Kim Campbell for a while, but she wasn't elected. Canada's never elected a woman as a head of state. Neither has the U.S. Right? And so it's very easy to cherry pick particular examples, but it's actually more instructive for us to refuse to just use this a singular framework for understanding other parts of the world. And that's an excellent point about Canada's lack of gender parity.
I just think that when we try to silo, when we try and say that especially our policies and programs do X, Y, and Z, we need to be critical of them at every stage, which leads me to my next question. A lot of social workers that are on this call work in government organizations, whatever various sectors that is, be it housing, food security, child welfare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can you give them, this is a question that has come up multiple times, a couple small things where they can try and challenge the system when it feels impenetrable to challenge?
Right, yeah. And I think it's like, I don't know. So I'm very good at criticizing things, that's for sure. I've been confident in my ability to criticize many a times. But in terms of change, I think the problem with trying to give kind of one-off tips in challenging things is it suggests that the system can even be changed from within or with individual applications of critique. Like I think, and this sounds a little bit like, huge or whatever, but we kind of just need to overthrow the system in the way that it is right now. Like I don't know that a bureaucracy that is premised upon the dispossession of the majority of the world's people can ever, just be engaged with kind of in an ad hoc basis towards making improvements. That said, even though the actual bureaucracy is so big and so hard to penetrate, the actual solutions are incredibly easy. Like Toronto, so the city of Toronto couldn't defund the police budget by 10%, and yet now they're like wringing their hands about how they can not be cutting services to oppressed peoples in the context of the pandemic, right? It's like the solutions are actually very easy, like massively, even if you don't want to abolish the police, massively cut the police budget. It's not necessary in any way. And police are agents of violence, we actually know. So the solutions are actually easy, but I don't think that they necessarily come just from individual challenges. Again, that said, an example that I just thought of that I think is useful and is particularly in the context of vulnerability. So I recently found out about this program that's being funded by Public Safety Canada, and it's meant to it's a program for Black youth that's meant to divert them from criminality. And the program constitutes like life skills workshops and emotional regulation workshops and all these things that work on actual Black youth in order to prevent their entrance into the carceral system. Mm-hmm. So we actually know that the reason why Black youth are disproportionately incarcerated, why they're victimized by the police, isn't because they're actually criminal, because they're being targeted by police. There's nothing that Black youth could do to emotionally regulate better that would immunize them from violence, right? And like we were saying, this is a problem with vulnerability discourse, is that it keeps the gaze on the people who are oppressed rather than the system that does oppressing. So on the one hand, we engage in these very complicated solutions of developing these complex programs about emotional regulation, blah, 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 blah. We engage in these very complex solutions to very simple problems. Stop targeting Black people, stop incarcerating them, like all of that, right? It's actually very simple. And so I think, wherever we can in our day-to-day lives, wherever we can challenge the operationalization of that vulnerability discourse, we have to do it because it pops up all the time. So if we can be in a meeting saying, why are we telling Black youth to emotionally regulate instead of telling cops to stop harassing them, I think that's something that we can do. But I think always we need to kind of keep our eye on the prize and recognize that these solutions don't come internal to bureaucracy. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, as Audre Lorde brilliantly put it. And so we always need to be conscious of working from outside the system to dismantle it.
And I think too, and maybe this is more of a personal thing than a professional thing, but as social workers, we have an obligation to not only provide immediate services, but to constantly be advocating for long-term societal systemic change, inside or outside the systems we're in. So if you don't wake up every single day, or most days, right now, especially with COVID, most days, I know it's hard. If you don't wake up with at least a fire to change the injustices that you're seeing every single day, we're not doing that second piece of social work. So we have an obligation to be constantly pushing the dial forward on structural oppression by first attending webinars like this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for considering this to be the first step in our journey. And then third, to realize that we're not going to change these systems until we are actively pushing the dial forward against them. So we do have to fundamentally shift policy in terms of the way that we advocate for our clients, especially federally, when we call for things like universal basic income and the decriminalization of sex work and the decriminalization of drugs and the ending of mandatory minimum penalties and drug offenses. These are policy positions and statements that the CASW has taken that we advocate for at Parliament Hill, but that you can advocate for as well in your organizations or to your elected officials or to your policy makers. So Khadija, any comments on those policy statements and ways in which individuals can advocate when they find the certain pieces that really resonate with the work that they do? Any comments on that?
Right. Yeah. And Alexandra, I think you brought up an excellent point, which is I was reading an article about the kind of professionalization of social work, which goes hand in hand with the way that our roles have also been individualized and medicalized, so that we see ourselves as, I heard this somewhere, like low rent psychiatrists and psychologists, just shittier versions of people who operate on the individual, right? When
Right.
our role even has always meant to be about recognizing that individual distress exists in a social context, and that usually individual distress is a product of that context, right? So I think you brought a very important point, which is that this is our job. um, it's our job as social workers, and for those of us who are settlers, it's our job as settlers. For those who are white, it's your job as allies, right? In every possible way, it's our job to actually be uh, pushing forward for structural change. I think that there's like, and I'm so glad to hear that CASW has been releasing these policy statements, and to know that you're doing the advocacy work on Parliament Hill. Are there ways that members can kind of specifically join in on these efforts?
Yeah, we love to hear from you. I love to hear from all of you. I say it usually on my webinars to let me know how you guys want to get engaged with the CISW, be that through social media or be that through contacting us directly. What I will say is I think that we don't understand the weight of our profession all the time in how much we are as experts in people and experts in social change and social justice. So you have an obligation to, if you are working in child welfare and they're trying to cut the child advocate, write an op-ed or write letters to your members of parliament, write open letters, and encourage the individuals in your organizations to sign on to them. We're going to do work over here in Ottawa, but we need you doing work at home as well, in your communities, in your organizations, contacting your members of parliament, contacting your elected officials, contacting us with certain policy positions and statements that you believe the profession needs to move the dial forward on. We're small here at the CSW. We try and do a lot, and we are a pretty mighty, a pretty fierce team here, but we do require the expert and knowledge and understanding of social workers across Canada. And hopefully you feel empowered to take your knowledge and expertise to every single elected official and every single parliamentarian possible. So that's my plug for how to get engaged or excited about advocacy. But yeah, I mean, contacting us and being in touch with us, like we silo, I think, social justice and advocacy. We're either a clinical social worker or we're a social worker that does advocacy. We don't really marry the two. I think you can do both. I think you have expertise and knowledge as social workers and social work professionals, especially social workers from backgrounds that aren't the traditional background of social workers in Canada. We need you to be speaking out, and then we need you to let us know when you need your national association to step in as well. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
Thank you. No, that was great. Thank you, Alexandra.
So Khadija, any final thoughts before we kind of wrap up here?
Oh, final musings on the state of the world.
Well, we're gonna do this. We're gonna do
Well,
another one, right? Like we're gonna do another one of these
yeah,
at some point. Yeah. Okay.
that's right. Thank
Okay.
you. Well, actually, Alexandra, if you don't mind, I had included this slide here that at in my other hat, as an anti-Islamophobia educator, I'm involved in a project, Islamophobia.com, which is we've produced a series of animated video shorts to describe systemic Islamophobia, and specifically to respond to the knowledge gap about how Islamophobia manifests in the Canadian context and how Islamophobia exists beyond hate crimes, but includes all of those state policy and practices and media representations that engender interpersonal violence. So we have 5 short videos. You can find them at islamophobia-is.com. The first one, More Than Hate Crimes, and it's narrated by Nahid Mustafa, and a producer. A video on mainstream media, narrated by Black activist Desmond Cole. The Myth of the Muslim Terrorist by Indigenous professor Hayden King. Islamophobia as Gendered by Palestinian activist and lawyer Noura Erakat, and The Myth of Sharia Takeover by Sophia Ali, who's a host of Let the Quran Speak. And so my contact information is up there and for the website as well. So I hope that that you will give us a visit.
I actually included the link in your Q&A. So for everyone who has the Q&A,
Oh, great.
I included the link there. It's also all of this information for Islamophobia is the website, the Facebook page, the video series are also in your handout section. If you're not seeing that pop up in your handout section, refresh the page and it'll come back. I think what we're going to try and do a webinar on Islamophobia is specifically, but for now, I think we're going to wrap up. I'm going to wrap up with my favorite comment from the presentation, which I echo wholeheartedly, from Georgina, and it says, "Thank you so much for this illuminating presentation. My only question is, how are you so cool?" So with that...
Okay, well, full disclosure, Georgina is a good friend of mine who is very generous with her praise.
So with that,
So
we're going to close.
Georgina.
Thanks, Georgina. I echoed it. I actually even published that question because I was sitting here thinking the same thing. So with all that being said, we are going to wrap up. Thank you to the CSW members who attended. Thanks to all of you who are watching the recorded version and sharing with your friends, family, colleagues, organizations, or watching at home again. If this was so good, you want to watch back, you can after the presentation concludes. Check your email for your certificate of attendance if you need that. Refresh the page, access the handouts, log on anytime you want. This presentation isn't going anywhere. You can log on and rewatch it. You can log on and access those handouts, access your certificate of attendance, access the speaker bios, all that jazz. Thank you for spending another hour and a half with us. We really appreciate it. We appreciate what you're doing. Happy International Human Rights Day as well. And yeah. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much, Khadija.
Thank you.